teaching them a sprint drill can very easily have no impact on their sprint mechanics, right? I would say, like, generally, it has no impact
Hmm.
on their sprint mechanics. And so I've kind of moved away from like hoping for that. Like, oh yeah, we're gonna do this B skip, and then now you're gonna have swing leg retraction in your sprint. Like that's not really a big part of my approach anymore. I view them more as contributing to your elastic training volume, like, contributing to how many times you're bouncing off the ground in our session.
That was Coach Dan Bach. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Great to have you here. It's great to have Dan back on the show. He is the founder of Jump Science, as well as the creator of the popular Speed Science Zero page on Instagram. He coaches at Acceleration Sports Performance in Austin, Texas, and Dan has been working with athletes in the realm of speed and power development for about a decade and a half. On the show today, Dan will be giving his perspective on how athletes' strengths or weaknesses show up in their sprinting technique. And he'll be talking about his approach to sprint technique given the idea of strength dictating function, or the fact that an athlete's innate strength, power development, their structure, how that is going to be inextricably linked to the sporting technique that they will exhibit. Dan will also talk about building elasticity, his use of plyometrics, how he builds up an athlete's vertical force capability. He'll give his take on sprint drills and so much more. Dan has such a practical and intuitive coaching style where his experimentation is backed up by data and linked to science. I really enjoy talking with Dan about all things training. This conversation I've been having some longer talks on this show lately. This one just flew by, an hour and 40 minutes. I know you guys will enjoy this one, and let's get on to the show. Before we get to it, just quickly, our sponsors for the show. Appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to these, as they are an important part of bringing the show to you every week. First, we have lostempireherbs.com for 15% off your Lost Empire Herbs order. Head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. There you can find my favorite go-to herbs that I've been using ever since I got Lost Empire Herbs CEO Logan Christopher on the show. I've been using his mental training techniques and having good success there. But then I also got into his herbalism. The Phoenix formula was the first one I tried out. It was amazing. You'll see that on that page. Shilajit resin, that's a really popular one in strength and conditioning circles. Heck, I even buy their soap. It's like pine pollen soap. It's amazing. I would definitely recommend that. I don't think that's on my little personal page there, but they have so much cool stuff. If you want a more natural approach to your supplementation, Lost Empire Herbs is the way to go. So check them out at lostempireherbs.com/justfly. Second is simplyfaster.com. They're a longtime sponsor of this show. If you have any sports training, sports data needs, their shop is an invaluable resource for you. So within data tracking, you have things like the Freelap timing system, bar speed velocity monitors, force plates. You also have training tools like the K-Box, blood flow restriction bands, which have been a mainstay for me. You also have slide boards like the Burn Board. That's a new item that's shown up in their store, and so much more. They have amazing customer service, and I'm really happy to have them as a sponsor of this show. Lastly, before we get started, I wanted to mention the Elastic Essentials online course. I'm sure if you've been around this podcast, you've heard of it. It is the lens, it is the window into how I view the process of training athletes, how I view the process from the foot upwards, how I look at plyometrics, speed, robustness and movement, strength and power development, as well as programming. It'll also get you CEUs for the NSCA, NASM, and more. If you want to check that out, head to justflysports.com and you can get started on that today. All right, that all being said, let's get to this uninterrupted episode with Coach Dan Bach. Dan, welcome back to the show. It's awesome to have you here, man.
Yeah, thanks. Looking forward to talking about some stuff.
Yeah, we both I think we started kind of on the same path in that we started much more in jumping, relatively speaking, than sprinting. And then Here we are both now, probably, I don't know if you're more in sprinting now, but I would say in the balance of things, I probably spend more time in sprinting than I do jumping. So it's just, tell me a little bit about your journey. Like obviously dunking initially, and then as you got into the performance world, tell me a little bit about how speed, or how you see the balance of those things, what we talk about on social media, what training looks like, and how have you evolved with that?
Yes, I would say first, I started out training with or like training people to jump higher, and then there was a time late in college where I got a chance to work with a couple track athletes and sort of dip my toes into the speed development realm. And at that point, my speed training ability was basically like, well, I know that they still need to get stronger, and then I know that there's going to be sort of this separation between strength and speed that we have to balance. And just kind of going on those principles, I had some good success with a couple people, and I really enjoyed that. And the idea of track appealed to me because it's a sport that's committed to athletic development, rather than just like, oh, well, we got to learn plays and learn a jump shot and do all this conditioning or whatever, like in team sports. So the sport appealed to me, and I was able to then get involved with the track team at my high school for a year after college. And then when I got the opportunity to work at this place called Acceleration in Austin, Texas, that's a place that's known for speed training. And, we work with like football and track are probably the two biggest sports, along with, soccer, lacrosse, softball, all these sports where acceleration and speed are paramount. So, making the shift to coaching at Acceleration, that really took me to a place where the work I was doing with people in person was actually largely speed focused rather than jump focused. Then I still am kind of like the jump guy there. So I have, basketball players, volleyball players, but even with them, they obviously jump a ton already, or, a lot of them do. If they don't, I encourage them to, like the basketball guys I'm talking about, like not all of them necessarily spend time dunking or trying to dunk. And so I'll tell them, especially like got a young 14-year-old kid or something, I'll be like, do you ever just like, try to dunk on a low rim? And I'll tell them, do that if you're not. But then even with those athletes, I like to use, complementary plyometrics, and max velocity sprinting is, one of the first ones I want to implement. So even with those jumping athletes, I'm using speed training. And as part of that, on the social media front, the content front, I just have so much to say about speed and sprint mechanics and training for it. And I see so many things that I want to push back on in the speed training realm. And so that has just stimulated this, this desire to like, okay, let's try to, one, figure these things out, two, bring some clarity to some topics where people are confused, three, tear down maybe some misconceptions or some traditions that, or maybe like a little bit that I question. So yeah, there's just a lot of exploration, a lot of things to say in the speed realm. And then also just I think people largely are not developing speed that successfully. If you look across athletes in a lot of sports, like how many are actually making their 40 faster year in, year out? How many are actually getting their fly time faster year in, year out? And I'm not trying to criticize the field. It's actually just a hard thing to do. Like speed's not easy to develop. There's a reason most athletes can't run sub 11 seconds at 100 meters. It's just not easy to do. And so with that, yeah, it's like I have a desire to learn how to do it. And if I have success with an athlete, I want to show it, and I want to say, this is how we did it. So yeah, that's how I've kind of ended up in this place where I have Jump Science is like, it's my brand. It's been around for a long time, but now I have this whole, I made a new Instagram account just for speed stuff because I wanted to have a place, an outlet for that. So yeah, that's how I've kind of ended up where I'm at now. And yeah, so the jumping is still big, like as far as social media. It's like I have a program and, have dunkers who are trying to jump higher. But the stuff I do in person is, actually more speed focused. So yeah, that's my evolution in that department.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you were saying before you had pushed record. It's like if you watch the ESPN top 10, it's like the dunks. It's almost like you can't deny. There's an undeniability about watching someone jump and do like a, Zion's windmill at the end of the game, right? Like the defiant windmill. Yeah. Like that's like it's such an exclamation point. But then when you actually get in the field, it's mostly just speed. It's almost like jumping is nice and it's like a highlight and it's fun. And not that it's not obvious if I'm in a jumping sport and just for the sake of being a better, more powerful athlete, that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
But it's almost like you get in the field and there's almost like something visceral about speed. Like how many people start fights on social media about jump mechanics? I mean, a few, but there's way
Right.
more fights about speed training. I mean, it's not even close. Or arguments about studies and all that stuff. I mean, how many people are, to my knowledge, there's never that many people arguing like a high jump mechanics study or a long jump or, anything like that. And I always feel like too, maybe there's even something like visceral, like when you're growing up, like the person who could jump high, like that's cool. But it's like when you got burned on the playground in like football, like that's like visceral, like, oh, like how can I,
Right.
I feel like that sticks with people. And obviously it's important for sport, but I think we all kind of remember that from when we were young too, for those of us who always wanted to get faster. So, man, I got so much to, I was going to say too, and part of that question stemmed from, you created a whole new account just for speed, like moving from, jump to speed. And so it's always cool to watch those posts and see what you're up to and how you are evolving your coaching. I wanted to start before we get into some more nitty gritty stuff, because I brought this story up. I referenced you in a podcast with Jared Burton recently, and it was on like, high volume type training concepts. And it was a guy who, lots of people, right, do too much strength, not enough speed and power, and then get faster. But it was an athlete who had been watching your stuff, got a lot faster, and did a bunch of like single leg bounds or something like that. I'm curious to hear that story from the actual person who told the story, to kick it all off with that, and to tell that story a little bit, some things that you think are interesting within that scope.
Yeah, so this was just a guy that I didn't coach personally. He was just a follower on YouTube, and he shared with me that he had been watching some of my content and where I had talked about how there's a separation between being strong and being fast, and if you find that you are getting stronger and not getting faster, then there's maybe a strategy you can use where you reduce or eliminate strength training largely, and then, like just kind of train at the fast end of the spectrum. And in particular, he saw a video of mine where I posted a athlete that I was working with he's only a 16-year-old, he's a sophomore in high school. He was doing some repetitive hops on one leg, and he looked very springy while doing it, right? He was like quick off the ground. And he was the only athlete I've coached in person who had a 2.0 one leg RSI. So like while doing that exercise, he was in the air for twice as long as he was on the ground. So he saw that kid doing that exercise and he went and tried it. And this was a football guy who's in his like early 20s. So he's a football guy, and he went and tried to do that exercise, and he was like, I was so bad at it. I was really slow off the ground. So I realized that I was strong, but not powerful, or he used some phrase like that, strong, but not something, or strong, but not explosive. Yeah. Something like that. And so he stopped strength training and he started working on that exercise specifically, I guess almost every day is what he said, which is not something I would actually recommend because it's like a high intense plyo. And then when he was telling me about this, it was actually after the fact. He had already taken the strategy, done it for 6 weeks, I think, and his 40 had gotten dramatically faster from like a 4.8 to a 4.4. And this was laser measured at a combine. So not, just like he hand timed himself faster or whatever. It was there was actually like online results posted of these two combines. He sent me the two spreadsheets from the 2 days. And sure enough, it was like, it was like a 4.86 or something. And it was like a 4.48. So he had this, over the course of a couple months, he had this pretty significant transformation in the speed department. And so that was a cool story to hear from him. But it reflects sort of a theme that I throughout my career of using that strategy of recognizing there's a big gap between squat strength or even power clean strength versus your speed, and understanding that gap exists, and then planning or adjusting your training based on your results in those two areas. So if you add 30 pounds to your power clean and you're not sprinting any faster, there's probably some potential there for you to get faster if you stop trying to get stronger and let yourself, specifically adapt to the speed end of the spectrum. Or so I use the term shift a lot, where like your body shifts from being strong to being fast, or maybe even just from being, sort of evenly developed to being like specifically developed. So yeah, I've got, lots of cases of that throughout my coaching career of, you hope it's a short-term thing where it's like you just have this little bit of, you just get a little bit of separation and between those two things. And so then you sort of shift back to the speed. But also the cases of football guys who have been lifting probably too much for years and they're, average or even slow in the speed department. And then they benefit from 6 months without squatting.
Yeah.
And you don't want that scenario. Like I'm not gonna utilize that scenario on purpose. Like, oh yeah, let's just get really strong for 8 months, ignore your speed, and then see what we can bring back after that. That's not what I want to do. But sometimes people come to me and they're in that situation. And so yeah, it's just that was a particularly dramatic example, I would say, of that concept of shifting from just being strong to being fast.
I would say too. Well, one thing I was going to ask you, with like the guy was doing it like every day, and I was talking about this idea in Jared's podcast. It's like if that was me as well, and it was before the fact, right? If the guy came to me before and's like, hey, I like this hopping exercise, I'd be like, oh yeah, maybe like twice a week, something like that, right? Typically.
Yeah.
But I wonder sometimes, like if someone's so driven on that, they're so sold on it, if I would actually, by telling them that, again, it's not something like now I still wouldn't have my athletes do that like every day, but it does. Do you ever think about that sometimes though, with like, if someone's so sold on it and there isn't that like any nocebo there, being able to tolerate some of that more high volume type plyo for that kind of thing?
Yeah, I do think about that. And it's not that it's not going to be good for them performance wise. It's just you wonder about their shin splints or their knees or whatever.
Yeah.
It's the durability factor.
Yeah, you give 20 athletes that, and not all 20 are going to make it through.
Right.
100%.
So that's what concerns me. But yeah, I mean, I think back to my days, or like a lot of people's days when they're getting into dunking. You dunk every day.
Yep.
And you don't think about it. And yeah, when you're maybe younger than 15, like you can definitely do that. Once you get, well, in my case, I was 6'3", 200 pounds as a 16-year-old. At that point, it's probably ill-advised to dunk every day or to do single leg bounds every day. But then, yeah, the other thing though is you think about him being a football guy, and I would think about this too with some of the guys I've worked with. And if you do have a bunch of squat strength built up, that does give you some level of durability.
Mm-hmm.
Where like I know, like I've had guys where they'll sprint, they'll like play pickup basketball, they'll do whatever random jumping exercises they want to do, and they'll do that most days of the week, and like they're fine. And it's still probably not ideal for performance because you're not going to be as fresh as you could be most of the time. But yeah, there's also that component of, what, if you can make it through this healthy, come out the other side, and then maybe get some rest, it's probably going to have a really good impact. Yeah, it still wouldn't be my prescription for somebody, but only like mostly just because of the health risks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, yeah, then next week, everybody's getting the 5. I remember, for me, I did, it was in my late 20s. I did like a depth jump every day experiment, which is bilateral. It's actually honestly not even as intense. Because the single leg bounding too, that was like kind of a knee tuck. Like you would, I think the hopping was not just like a low level rudiment. It was like the knee bounces up after each. So it was like a more intensive version.
Yeah, it was not like warm up hopping.
No,
for sure.
Yeah. But I was going to say too, well, I'll just quickly with the depth jump. Like I found like, and I was in a place where I was highly trained as well. I'm glad you mentioned that too, because if you just gave that to anybody who didn't have that bank of robustness built up, they could end much more poorly. Right. Maybe some people would survive it, but having that bank of robustness, a better position. And I did a depth jump every day, and I found after 1 week of the depth jump every day thing, my vertical actually had gone up in that short term, like 3 inches. It wasn't my all-time best.
Oh, I believe that.
But it was like a blast, and it was like really cool. But I found after the second week of doing that, because like, oh, this is good, I'll keep going. I think I was about the same. So it was almost like it took everything I already had and it just expressed it really, really, really well. And you would figure maybe that football player, I think that guy was super strong too, like really big squat to body weight, and just like I already had it, but it was able to just keep expressing it really well. Shoot, I almost really, now I'm talking about it, I kind of want to do that, the single leg bound every day just to see what happens and the weeks of that. But yeah, it's really an interesting thing. I wrote this down, Dan, as you were talking, and it wasn't on the question list, but I want to ask because you said single leg RSI. I haven't heard too many people. Rich, who created the plyomat, has talked about that. That's something they measure as single leg. We talked about double leg RSI last time, but Rich had said that the single leg seemed to be way more like you got standing vert, maybe a little bit lower transference. RSI maybe a little higher, but I think from what Rich was saying, he liked the single leg RSI more. Like he felt like that was the most applicable. I'm curious what your experience with testing and noticing trends with that is.
Yeah, so I don't test it a lot just because most athletes aren't that good at the exercise.
Yeah.
And I do more of a subjective evaluation.
Yeah. I hear you. I understand that. Yeah. Yeah. It's like you could tell pretty quick if you say, hey, do some single leg bounds and see if you can get your knee up on each one. You could tell pretty quick.
Yes. And I'll do things like, okay, so we're going to do the hop, the hops with the tuck. So you're pulling the foot up. But then we're going to move forward. And okay, so this first time, let's move forward, just get like 5 yards in 5. So it's, you're not moving far at all. And then, okay, now let's try to just push it out to 6 or 7 yards in 5, 7 or 8 yards in 5. Can you get out to 10 yards in 5? And even just moving at like walking or like slow jogging speed through those, it requires you to get off the ground faster. So I'll even use that as a way of kind of evaluating how good they are at it. Yeah, I haven't done a lot of the one leg RSI. It's only a handful of athletes that are good at the exercise where I've actually used that. So then I don't have a bunch of data to like connect it to sprinting compared to two leg RSI. I will say the ones I have that are good at it, like they are good sprinters. One of them is actually a volleyball player, and so she doesn't train sprinting except a little bit with me. So she hasn't really had a chance to find out how good she could be at sprinting. But yeah, it is definitely, there's definitely a connection between those things, the single leg RSI and sprint speed. It is interesting though, because I think, being on one leg, it actually is more strength based than your two leg RSI.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree, actually. I have a story with that, but I would agree with you.
Because you have a much higher load than you do, much higher load per leg. So, like double the load. So, yeah, you could theorize actually that the two leg RSI would be more connected, but obviously there's the specificity component of the single leg and like with the cycle action and everything. So, yeah, I don't have anything definitive to say on the comparison of those two.
Yeah, it just my story is this is just an N of one with me. So, because I actually stopped doing this exercise as much I don't use I used to do a lot of a single leg depth jumps personally. I don't use a single leg depth jump as much. If it's like a track, like a high jumper specific, I would be more inclined. But most athletes, I'm more concerned with a lot of other things that are lower on the totem pole. Right. And even the single leg, I will revert to a more like, let's be fast off the ground first, way more than I would say, hey, let's do this single leg depth jump. I found when I was in high school, I was doing the Science of Jumping program. It was real big 20 years ago. And single leg depth jumps were one of the things. And I think once I kind of started to get creative with that program, I found that if it was 3 days after I did a bunch of like single leg depth jumps, which honestly, the ground contact, I bet you was like 0.4 on those. Like it was long. It was long. But my two leg jumps would be amazing. Like I go to pick open gyms and my double leg jumps would be awesome, but my single leg would be kind of like meh. And I found like it was more the double leg quick off the ground seemed to be better for the single leg jumping. So, but I think, yeah, with the sprinting, I think there's probably more at play too than maybe just one variable too. It is one leg, but it also could be quick contact, a lot of things.
Right. Yeah, a lot of things to consider there. But both are good things to look at for sure.
Yeah.
Like one and two leg RSI.
Yeah, I get what you said too with a lot of it, I think, is ease of measurement. Because I'm kind of the same way. Just how good do you look hopping on one leg? Or
Yes.
and like you said, like, all right, now let's make it horizontal. Maybe even doing just like hey, you get a 5-yard run in and then take 3 bounds on your left or something like that's, if you can do that well, you're probably have a pretty good single leg RSI, I'd imagine, for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah. The hops for distance is another test I do. But again, so that's it's a hard exercise that can get very sloppy.
Yes.
So even with that one, I tend to stay at, okay, well, let's do maybe 90% of the distance you could do, but like keep it smooth and bouncing off the ground as opposed to, these just hard, like slapping the ground, like collapsing on each one, but sort of just finding a way to manufacture distance. Yeah. So even those, I only do the actual distance with some athletes versus just trying to get quality hops moving forward and then just, yeah, maintaining a certain level of like posture and springiness. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen how you go from max distance on one leg. It can turn into some things that are not necessarily really evaluating like reactive abilities anymore.
I would say you're more assessing pure robustness because the positions some kids get into are so bad trying to do that.
Yeah.
Like, hey, you're staying healthy and your knee went that way, and to get this, I know exactly what you're saying. In fact, me saying that probably reflects more of the track hat. Like, yeah, if I'm working with like high school or college jumpers, they make that look pretty good, and they are using lower leg elasticity. If I ask your average 16-year-old who walks in the gym to say, hey, run 5 yards and then give me 3 bounds, it is going to be like slap and then like a weird soccer kick to go forward, slap,
Yes.
So exactly. I'm glad you did say that. I do think there's a level where it's kind of like a gray sliding scale of how fast I can actually get going and still utilize a good single leg spring.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. I tend to do like the 1-step approach even.
Yeah. I think that's a good place. Yeah, good place to say off. There's a lot that could go wrong with you give it average, not track jumper, 5 yards to get started. Okay. Right. So, all right. So let's get more into, and I'm sure we'll talk about jumping stuff and plyo stuff as we go on, and I forgot to put this in the question list. So I'm going to go now, but I can't believe I forgot this one. Literally when I was thinking about these, throughout the last week, like this was like the first one because you had posted on this is basically what you think about sprint drills, which I think people who have been listening to this show they already know what's coming with that, but just from like the level of like an extensive plyometric too, because I think that, what you said about sprint drills and the relationship to like maybe just being extensive plyometric. Anyways, without saying any more about that, tell me a little bit about your thoughts on sprint drills and then the relationship to actual mechanics and then also as a plyometric.
Yeah. So, I think the idea with sprint drills is you're taking some component of sprint technique and then practicing it in like a form that's easier to execute the technique, whether that be some type of cycle or just, picking the foot up high or whatever, or, not butt kicking, but, being front side or whatever. That's sort of the typical idea behind sprint drills. And so they're used to teach technique. My experience with them is, and keep in mind, I work with, middle school and up athletes. So some young kids, teaching them a sprint drill can very easily have no impact on their sprint mechanics, right? I would say like generally it has no impact on their sprint mechanics. And so I've kind of moved away from like hoping for that. Like, oh yeah, we're going to do this B skip and then now you're going to have swing leg retraction in your sprint. Like that's not really a big part of my approach anymore. I view them more as contributing to your elastic training volume, like, contributing to how many times you're bouncing off the ground in our session. And with that in mind, that cuts down a lot of the drills that I use because not all of them are that bouncy or that fast off the ground. So, like the two main ones that I use are just like your track style butt kick, where you're picking the foot up underneath the hip. I just call it the high feet drill nowadays.
I like that.
And it's just like, nice quick tempo. So you're being fast off the ground and then you add speed to that progressively. Once an athlete can do it reasonably, you start trying to add horizontal speed to it and it sort of turns into a sprint stride as you add speed to it. And that's, it's a warm-up drill. It's getting foot contacts in, probably every time you do the drill, you're getting another 20 foot contacts in. And then that one I will use as a way to try to plug into sprint mechanics a little bit. Not necessarily with every athlete, like it doesn't really connect for everybody. But sometimes, like particularly your team sport athletes that don't really have max velocity experience, they can benefit from that. Okay, just you need to make sure you have high feet in your sprint. So we're going to do this drill. You're going to add speed to it. And then basically, if you add enough speed to it, you're going to end up sprinting the way we want you to sprint.
Yeah. The knees will come up as you add speed, accordingly.
Yeah. And as you add speed or as you get into your sprint, like it is going to turn into more of a backside butt kick than the drill is. But that's good. We want high feet, even if it's backside, right?
Mm-hmm. Bigger wheel.
Yeah. And so your basketball, football, lacrosse type of athletes, like they can benefit from that. But the big thing for me is that it's all experimental. It's not this black and white thing like, oh, if you learn this drill, you will run this way and it will be faster. It's, what, we can explore this, see what happens. Maybe it is just a warm up for us. Maybe it is something that we try to plug in on the track in a sprint and it could actually help you. But which one of those things it's going to be, I don't really know.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to pretend that I do know. And I'm not going to be like, oh, do this drill to take 2/10 off your 40. Like, no, that like the classic Instagram post, to get a bunch of attention. I'm not going to make that post. I'm not. It's just not a black and white thing. Oh, we learned this drill. Now we're going to sprint faster. So yeah. Oh, and then the other thing is, there's so many drills out there. And if there is some value in learning technique, it's highly individual to the athlete. One drill could make something click for an athlete and it could be completely worthless for another one. So it's not like, oh yeah, let's B skips just make everyone faster. No, I mean, they could, in theory, have some role for some athlete. Again, you don't know. You can try it, and I got nothing wrong with anybody trying any drill, because I get people asking me, hey, is this a good drill? Well, I don't know, try it. A learning process is not a consistent thing across all people. So there's just no way to be like, oh yeah, this is a good drill and this is not a good drill. You just don't know. It's just, you can try it. And, there's nothing wrong with trying it. But yeah, I mean, overall, I'm pretty skeptical on drills like changing sprint technique and actually making people faster. I really, generally am using them more for, the elastic training volume, and it's part of the warm-up process. Yeah, so like stiff leg running or stiff leg bounding is kind of my other go-to drill. But that's just like a fun athletic thing to do, And I don't often try to connect that to sprint mechanics. I'll have people do it in their warm up and be like, oh, let's cover 20 yards in 10 bounds, or, if you're athletic, like 10 yards or 20 yards in 8 bounds, stiff leg bounds. But I'm not like, okay, so now remember that scissoring action that you did in the bound. Now let's go put that into your sprint, like, and feel the exact, like that's not really a thing I talk about ever anymore. So yeah, I don't necessarily treat it as a speed drill so much as just a fun warm up and a fun way to get elastic work in.
I love that. There's some things you said. I was like nodding my head like a bunch, and I wrote like 3 things down.
Yeah.
One thing was so cool. It's like, it's hoping for transfer. I think that's kind of where we all start. It's like, we do all these drills that we've been taught or everybody did. And you eventually are like, oh, I know this is going to transfer some point. Eventually you're going to start looking like this. It's at that hoping that eventually, if you do enough of them. But it's like, it's just crazy to me. There's like so many videos I'll watch where athletes do all that stuff. They do all the drills and they're clearly pretty good at them. And then they go sprint and look nothing like it. And I always wonder what their coach is thinking. Like, are they thinking, oh, if they just keep doing some more? I think a lot of coaches, honestly, I think it's almost maybe it's by design, or people almost learn to just forget about it, like just go sprint. And maybe I remember I was kind of like that when I was coaching at Wilmington College in my mid-20s. We did all the drills, and like I was always telling them, at least for the drills, I was always, saying, oh, posture and get your knees up or toes up or whatever. And then I don't remember at that time ever really making a big deal of how they actually sprinted, though. And I think
Right.
that was for the best, honestly. And I even remember when I was in college, we did all the A's and B's and all that stuff. And I was the person who's going to try hard. I want to do this right. But I don't ever remember, my coaches never, and I'm actually very thankful for this, is I don't ever remember sprinting trying to think about that. And I remember how I sprinted when I was not fast when I was in college. I was a high jumper first because I wasn't fast, and then triple jumper second because you could still get away with not being super fast. Long jump was my worst jump because, but I still ran. I could still hit like 16 high, 17 low, and a 150, which isn't great, but that's still decent. And I remember when I was running that, like my knees it was a fast stride cadence. My knees were lowish. Like I did not run like the high knee glide at all, and I didn't even think about it. And I didn't start to think about it till my mid-20s when I was coaching. And I was like you, I started with more jumping, and then I'm coaching speed. I got to learn about it. And as I'm learning, I'm like watching all these videos, trying to run just like they tell you. And my athletes would be like, "Oh, coach has got great sprint technique." And then I like run a 150 with my athletes, and they blow my doors off. Running with low knees, like all this stuff, like I'm like, and so you sit and you think about that, and you're like, where is it starts those seeds of like, oh, maybe that isn't going to eventually transfer, or maybe I could. But at the same time, I like what you said with like it offers like an extensive plyo warm-up value, because I think at the same time, if you just totally eliminate it, well, you are getting like a lot of bouncy plyo contacts. And if you just, and athletes like doing them. I mean, they are like, cross-connecting gait, and there's bounce, and I think there's value there. So it's like to totally throw them away. It's just don't try too hard with them, and go to that mentality.
Yeah, and I think, another theory you could have is like, if there is going to be transfer, it's going to be subconscious.
Yeah, yep.
Where, we picked our knees up and dorsiflex so many million times over the course of 10 years. Now there is actually maybe some little transfer to sprinting, but it's not because we thought about trying to do it during sprinting. It's just like built in now. That's another theory you could have. I don't necessarily subscribe to that too much, but yeah, I mean, you could have different theories about the transfer. But yeah, I think you made a great point about the thinking during sprinting and trying to do it. I mean, if anything, it's a very small piece of the training process. Yeah.
Yeah, with that, I feel like the only part could maybe be if it's a lot of like single leg, like bouncy stuff, maybe that foot ankle complex gets a little stiffer as a result of that over a long period of time.
Right.
And maybe you can bring that.
Development.
Yeah, maybe, and it's the physical that maybe ends up, the body uses that physical, but I don't think anything technical about moving 1 meter a second is going to really show up in a wheel. It's not a wheel. Sprint drills are not a wheel. It's just like, and I think that people don't, it's just like this easily controllable thing. Like you said, you can see it, and I can tell anybody to put their knee up and toe up, and I feel like I'm coaching them. But then it's like, oh wait, they didn't run like that. And so, I like, you mentioned, I love that you said this. You mentioned it is an experiment. And I think because people don't like that. They want to go to a seminar or a coaching clinic, and they don't want to come away with experiments in their head. And I was just doing a seminar this weekend, and I'm taking people through acceleration constraints, I'll call it. I like thinking about like the Bondarchuk pyramid. Like at the top, you have actual sprinting, actual jumping, whatever. At the bottom of the pyramid is just all the general stuff, like leg twists and arm curls and calf raises or whatever. And then the second layer it's the SDE. I almost like, and the third is SP, but the SDE is like that special strength. That's like maybe that's the very close sprint constraints. You could say maybe it's pulling a sled. Of course, you might say that's actually the main thing, but stuff that's really close. It's still a wheel. And we're going through some of these different constraints, like different falling starts, different versions of sled drag with like a shin drop. But after each one, I would look at the group and I would say, hey, thumbs up or thumbs down, somewhere on that. How helpful was that? Because we would actually sprint after. How helpful was that? How much did you feel that show up in your sprinting? And it's like, that's kind of how it should be, though. I have this realization. That is how it should be. Not everything. If you just go and say every single thing transfers 100%, you're living in a dream world that you kind of manufactured. And it takes the fun away, to be honest. Like, part of the fun of coaching is looking that everyone is different. And even in like Bondarchuk's system, like I'm sure every thrower had a different set of like special exercises that worked that they liked the most. Like, hey, this guy likes heavy winds, heavy like 40-pound hammer winds. This guy likes this kind of like sandbag throw or something the most. And there's just these different, to me, that's the fun of it. So I like that you said that. It's like, it's almost like getting the sprint drills to transfer. It's almost like taking the thing at the bottom of the pyramid, the GE, the general, like the leg twist, and trying to make that like the thing, the lock that's going to get you there, So that's just what came across my head as you were talking about that. Because the experiment thing, I think more people, and the last thing I'll just say is I think that it does frustrate people if the coach just says, oh, well, it just depends. But they don't offer any like guidance. You know what I'm saying? That is kind of frustrating to say, well, where am I supposed to go? Give me something, so I just think that's an easy thing to also frustrate people without offering any like crumbs that say, hey, well, here are some, you could say SDEs. Here are some constraints I really like. And this constraint works for this type of person. This one works for this type of person more. But it's at the end of the day, It is complex. And I think that's the beauty of it.
Yes. Every person is a new puzzle to solve. And that's part of the fun of coaching, and especially the fun of having success, is because it's like, oh, well, this wasn't just a blueprint that I used with this person, like I actually solved some things along the way, and I had some ideas and I evaluated those ideas, and then these couple ideas worked out, and that's awesome. That's fun experience to go through, rather than, well, here's my list of drills and we just did them, and they worked or didn't work or whatever. Yeah.
It definitely, I think at some point you would get bored if it was literally just, let's do ABC skips and that will be the magic path that we just keep doing, just keep doing them. You're eventually going to get there. Just keep going. And I mean, not to put down like the need for repetition and things. Like I think doing simple things very savagely well over time is critical, but there's just more to it than just do this one thing. And now this insanely complex human skill of sprinting will be yours, So.
Right.
Dan, you had an awesome post on your speed Instagram. I love this. And I think it was something, if you read the comments, you saw how many coaches intuitively connected with it. And you were talking about, and I'll put this in the show notes, and if you want to further that post, but it was basically, it showed two different stick figures of sprinters. And one of them had the foot landing, I don't know, it was like maybe 6 inches or 8 inches in front of the hip landing, like a small strike width underneath. So the
15 centimeters is what it was.
Yeah, 15 centimeters underneath. So not quite as far in front. Another sprinter struck their leg further in front and used more of the ground. Their foot was on the ground longer in their sprint stride. And you had said that rather than thinking of it in the sense of, oh, this one's wrong, more think of it as, how is this athlete solving the problem of sprinting as fast as possible? And so could you go into the difference? The numbers. I don't have the numbers in my head in front of me. I don't want to butcher any of those. So could you go into those two examples and that post of yours as to how these athletes are differently solving the problem of sprinting as fast as possible?
Yeah. Okay. So huge topic. And I would say, just bear with me. This is probably going to be a long-winded answer.
That's okay. This one needs a long-winded answer, so no problem.
Yeah. So first of all, I would say, we have this concept of like different perspectives and different things to consider when it comes to, let's say, solving a problem, or even like resolving a debate, let's say. So an example comes to mind of like an ethical debate, right? Of, okay, I have this principle that I don't want to hurt people. Okay, and that's a principle that I follow, and that informs my decisions. Okay, well, what if you have children and someone's invading your home? Isn't there like another ethic that comes to mind there? Or isn't there something else you have to consider in that situation, right? And that very well may get you to compromise your principle of not harming people, right? There's like a different ethic that sort of takes precedence over this one. And obviously there's a million examples of that type of thing. So in sprint mechanics, I would say that your traditional technique model has, it's basically based on one thing, and that's sort of this like common sense idea, or seemingly common sense idea, that if we're trying to sprint forward, then we don't want to push backward. Right? Or we want to push backward like as little as possible. And the entire sprinting technical model is basically just based on that. And it's like, yeah, okay, I mean, that makes sense at some level. However, there's another perspective. There's something else we need to consider. And if we look at the physics of sprinting, you're going to find that, the horizontal demands of sprinting are not what limit your speed. Okay, so I can, let's say, someone's top speed, or, let's say my top speed is 10 meters per second. I can overcome the air resistance to get to 11. Like, air resistance isn't stopping me. And also, if I have braking force in the initial touchdown, I can also overcome that by pushing behind me more easily enough. Like, the horizontal demands are not what's preventing me from going past 10 meters per second. It's the vertical demands. It's being able to overcome gravity fast enough so that I can move over the ground at this speed and stay on my feet. Okay. And that is, I would say it makes sense in theory. It also is supported by research, right? All the research we have about, the vertical spike in ground force. And, it's a pretty, direct connection where it is you are able to create higher force relative to your body weight within a shorter time frame that allows you to move over the ground faster. And if you want to prove it to yourself, it's the overspeed concept, right? Like, okay, if somebody pulls you with a car at some speed, you get past your top speed, you're not going to be able to stay on your feet anymore. Even though you have all the horizontal force you could ask for from a car pulling you, right? You're still going to fall. So the horizontal force is not what's going to help you run faster. It's actually your ability to overcome gravity, like, fast enough. Okay, so if we view sprint mechanics in that lens, then we see that contact distance, so the amount of distance that your center of mass covers while your foot is on the ground, or you could think of it as like how far your foot strikes in front of you plus how far you push off behind you, right? That's your contact distance. Greater contact distance gives you more time on the ground during which you can overcome gravity. And so in that sense, then greater contact distance is actually an asset. That's helping you solve the problem. And your traditional technical model is basically all about shortening contact distance, right? It's like high knee lift, swing leg retraction, get your foot as close to underneath you as possible. And then you're also trying to get off the ground quick behind you. And so that you can not have backside and get to the front side quick. And that's the traditional model. And that's all going to shorten contact distance. Well, let's say at a given speed, shortening contact distance means you have less contact time. Okay, so your velocity is like your contact. Oh boy, here we go. Contact distance divided by contact time, right, is going to be your average velocity during foot contact. And so if you shorten your contact distance, you have less time on the ground at a given speed, which means that you have to produce greater vertical force. So even without running faster, let's say you were to implement the technical model better, you are increasing the force demands by implementing the technical model, even at the same speed. Okay, so all that being said, the people that are able to use something close to the technical model, it requires elite vertical force application. So yeah, at the highest level, you got people 12 meters per second, they're sprinting, and then, using something close to the technical model, let's say, well, that's going to mean that they have to get off the ground in, at the highest level, it's usually like 0.08 or 0.09 seconds, right? Like Bolt was, I guess, 0.09 at his best, but he was 6'5". Like most of the sprinters are more like 0.08 or even,
they're even
sub
quicker.
0.08.
Yeah, they're even quicker off the ground than he is. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they're able to do that, but they have the ability to get off the ground that fast. Somebody else maybe nowhere near that vertical force relative to body weight to get off the ground that quickly. Yeah, you'll have people, let's say at the high school level, team sport, like they're on the ground for 0.13, 0.14, And so you can't then expect them to utilize like a short contact distance the way an elite sprinter does. That it's not a formula for speed for them. They're going to have to use a longer contact distance because that's going to give them the contact time that they need. And so you have this give and take between, using proper technique and shortening contact distance. You have a give and take between that, and then but longer contact distance gives us more time on the ground to work with. And different athletes are going to sprint their fastest at various points along that spectrum. And it's going to be dependent on the physical talent and the physical ability that they've developed to bounce off the ground quickly. So the example I gave was, okay, instead of 0.15 meters or 15 centimeters in front, you strike 45 centimeters in front, which a lot of people might look at and be like, oh, that's too far in front. That's bad technique, because you're probably, generating a greater braking impulse. So 45 centimeters in front and then pushing behind you, I think it was 85 or
I think
the
total stride. I remember the total stride being 1.2. It was like the fast person was 1 meter, and I guess regardless, and 45 does seem like a little bit in front. Maybe it was less than that. I trying to figure out how far in front.
I think it was 45 and then 75. But it doesn't matter. Like the example that I gave, the example that I gave doesn't really matter. But so the point is, a person utilizing a longer contact distance, giving themselves more contact time, then I think the example I said, at 10 meters per second, now they have 0.12 seconds on the ground, and that might be a contact time that they're capable of utilizing. Whereas if they were using the more traditional technique, where they're shortening their contact distance to 1 meter, and now they have 1/10 of a second on the ground, they very well may not be physically capable of doing that.
Yeah.
And so with that in mind, you just can't force people into this model, because there's a physical requirement that goes along with using a technique.
Yes, 100%.
And that applies across all movements, but sprinting in particular, it's like you're really running into the limit of your ability when you're trying to sprint fast. It's not negotiable. The physics are like, it's just very, very clear. And so then the key thing is, with that contact distance, striking further in front, maybe pushing a little bit more behind, that's also going to influence what you look like in your swing phase. This is probably going to be an athlete that has some more backside mechanics because they have to push behind themselves a little more. And they're probably going to have a little less front side because they're not going to get as much swing leg retraction at the ground, since they are contacting further in front. So they're not going to look like the technical model, but that might be the way that they solve the problem of trying to sprint, in that example I gave of 10 meters per second. And that comes from, for me, comes from observation of, working with a variety of athletes, variety of levels. Like, this person is not going to sprint with the technical model. Like, they're not going to do it. It's not going to work for them. I could teach them to do a B run, let's say, front side dominant, swing leg retraction. I could teach them that, and they could probably execute that drill at 6 meters per second. Because at 6 meters per second, you can have a short contact distance and then still have the necessary contact time. But as they start trying to move faster, they're going to have to utilize more contact distance. And the more you see a variety of athletes, the more you have to be confronted with that fact.
Yes, you are confronted with it. Yes, daily.
You just can't make, I have a defensive lineman who's 260 pounds, great, good athlete, going to play D1 football. He's not going to sprint like a Mustafa Powell, right? And there's not probably any value in trying to make him sprint that way, or trying to even push him in that direction. What I can do is try to develop his lightness on his feet. Do sprinting, do plyometrics, things of this nature, and try to give him some better reactive capabilities that will help him run faster. Trying to push him into front side dominance, I think, is going to be, a very fruitless pursuit. So with all that in mind, it would be nice to say, okay, well, an athlete with these characteristics will sprint this way. And an athlete with, a different set of characteristics will sprint that way. And I would say in that department, we are very, very early on in trying to discover those things. I don't pretend to have answers there. or like a lot of answers there. But, just a simple example would be like shorter athletes very well may have to utilize a strategy that creates more contact distance at very high levels. So I think Shelly-Ann Fraser-Price is a great example of that. She's arguably the best female sprinter of all time, and she's 5'0". So she's going high velocities. So, if she was executing the technical model perfectly, her contact time would have to be so short.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, with those short legs, like it just, yeah.
Yeah.
It's fun to watch those shorter sprinters, by the way, the 5-footers who are that fast relative to tall. I enjoy it.
And so if you watch her sprint, she'll have a period like around the late drive phase where she's got like some big front side mechanics.
Oh, yeah.
Like a brief moment in there where it's like, oh yeah, there it is. But then the back 50 meters of the race, she is sort of descending into anterior pelvic tilt, lower knees in front, big backside mechanics. And you can look at that and be like, okay, well, yeah, that's the deceleration portion of the race.
She pulls away though for her, or she stays. She maintains for being 5 feet tall. Like I'm blown away by how well she maintains her top end speed relative.
And so yeah, you can look at it and be like, oh well, that's not the best part of a race. Like as she's accelerating, as she's hitting her top speed for maybe 5 to 10 meters, that's where you need to look. It's like, okay, well, she's still out sprinting everybody else during this section of the sprint. And like you said, even pulling away from other sprinters. So she's apparently decelerating less than some of them. And so she is solving the sprinting puzzle in a way that works for her.
Yes, for her, exactly.
And you can't, if she, as the fastest female ever, or, one of the fastest females ever, if she is utilizing that technique and she, like, front side dominance doesn't really work for her, what business do I have trying to force it on a high schooler?
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense. And I guess the common argument would be like, oh, well, if she had better technique, she would run so much faster.
That's where it all. That's the starting point, though. To me, is. And so I'll just say this really quick, and then if you had anything else. But it's where do you start? Do you start at the model that someone who's looking at one or two things came with, or do you start with looking at nature? And I mean, we look at like, well, how did like the blackbird plane, come up? Like all these designs of planes come from watching birds, and that's just one example. Right. And to me, it's like, well, I'd rather spend time watching how a 5-foot individual was able to sprint so well and even maintain her lead and pull away from some of the slow. I mean, I think there are a few people who are faster in those last 50 than Shelly. I mean, she's 5 feet tall, but she does an amazing job for 5 feet tall. Sha'Carri Richardson too. I'm like watching them. I'm like, I think you learn so much by watch Usain Bolt, watch someone who's 5 feet tall. Well, and so anyways, sorry, I just had to, I was like, that's good. Anyways, if you had anything, sorry to interrupt you or anything more on that train of thought there.
I mean, I think I've made my point, but like, So like height is one example where maybe this has an impact as we get to certain velocities on how people are gonna sprint. I think another example would be like, just elastic versus inelastic. So let's say again, you're not going to see a slow, heavy athlete in Olympics and sprinting, but you might see him in other sports, right? You might see him in American football, you might see him in basketball, whatever. Somebody who maybe their RSI isn't very high. And so that's going to be another example where, okay, they don't have the physical ability to bounce off the ground very fast. So then when sprinting, they're not going to just like suddenly be able to manifest this. They're going to use the abilities that they have to sprint. Okay, so if I have let's say I have a linebacker who's 240 pounds and has a 500-pound squat, and his RSI is, 2.5, like more average. I'm not expecting him to sprint with front side dominance. He's going to have to utilize more contact distance in order to sprint his fastest. Again, he could use the technical model at some velocity. I don't think it's going to be, though, the fastest way for him to sprint. And so that's another example. I think another one would be, okay, if we look specifically at like, are people strong in their quads versus their glutes? or their calves,
Mhm.
like that concept. So I've had a number of athletes that have taught me this, where it's like, oh yeah, this person is like really naturally good at squatting and like pistol squatting and stuff like this. And so they do a high skip, and you can see they put their foot into the ground and just like pop up, like you can just see them tapping into this quad strength. Well, they're the same athlete when they sprint.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, 100%.
They're gonna use that when they sprint too. So they, even in the acceleration phase, they're not gonna do huge big hip split and then swing leg retraction driving the foot back into the ground. They're going to load their quad more in their acceleration. They're going to use more braking and pushing, and that's going to be the way that they sprint the fastest. And you could still introduce like a concept of a big push and like striking back of the ground, but the degree to which they execute it is not going to be the same as somebody who hates to squat
Mhm.
and has a huge deadlift and has like a sprinting background and they're really light on their feet. Like those people are not going to sprint their fastest in the same way. So that's just a few examples of like how those different abilities might affect how somebody sprints. But again, that's all. It's just a few ideas I have. It's not like black and white thing where oh, let me just take a few measurements on you and then I'll just prescribe your ideal sprint mechanics to you. Like it's not, it's really just about being open minded and understanding that people are going to solve the sprinting puzzle in different ways.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Even I think it was Dan Fichter who had first said like the idea of strength dictating function. And as soon as you start to look at it as someone who is solving the problem of sprinting to the best of their ability, given their strengths, and then almost using their sprint form to say, oh, this is your strength. This is your strength. This is your strength.
Yeah.
And then looking at it and going out from there versus I like the idea too of like, if you're going to change anything, you have to stimulate your organism. Like Tommy John has said this, you have to stimulate your body to the highest level it's ever been to change anything. And it's like someone who's been blasting their quads their whole life in every way they move, every explosive way, every squat. Do you think a few B skips are going to change that? It would have to be the most loaded B skips of all time, and their structure would have to change too, to be honest. A lot of these people's just structure there. We talk about infrasternal angle, wide, narrow ISA. Like there would be so much you would have to change to get them to do that. It just would be very fruitless. And, back to something you had said. So back to the beginning, I'll just have just a couple things here because I think this topic could be a 3 podcast, like a part 1, part 2, part 3. We could, there could be so much here. With the vertical force thing, and I will say I think a little bit differently on the vertical horizontal than I think you do, but I don't think it's that important for the sake of this specifically. But I will say I totally agree with that vertical spike because we both know that a faster sprinter at top end has that quick hit of vertical spike. You made that post about it, and so I would look at like if you had listed each athlete 0 through 100, what is your vertical spike ability? Your ability to generate that spike. And let's say an athlete, the people they're studying and making these models after, they're 90, they're 95 out of 100. And I get an athlete who's 60 out of 100, I can't, the same way you would say, hey, go squat 400 pounds. Well, my max is 250. I can't, what's going to happen? You're just going to get folded up. And what happens in sprinting is you just end up just don't do it. You just go to something else. Or even if I try to squat, if my good technique squatting ability is 250 pounds and you put 275 on the bar, maybe the first bit of the way up I can do it, but then I have to bend and use my back to get the rest of it. It's the same thing. You go to where you have the strength. And so
you're going to be forced into something else.
Yeah. And the speed will force you into something else. Anyone can make a 3 meter per second, like little skippy sprint drill look pretty good, but hey, when that vertical force spike demand goes up and up and up. Yeah. I'll try to make this, I guess, as practical as I can in the sense of I had a few things written down with what you said, but for team sport athletes. So I know you work with both track and team sport. To me, the question would be, especially with like that vertical force spike, I believe, and I imagine you think the same thing, but let me know if not, like a lot of that comes from a more straightish swing leg retraction. Like you're not going to get massive vertical force with a more bent oriented leg. I think the studies from team versus sprinters have shown that. So my question would be, for team sport athletes, like how much do you care about some of those, like getting to some of those mechanics? Like I think we've talked on this podcast before about the ability to run differently at top end speed and be a little more didactic in your ability. But just thoughts on training team sport athletes versus track athletes in light of everything you're talking about there.
Yeah. So it's it's mostly for me about just letting them sprint and getting them the exposure to it. I do, like I said, like I mentioned before, like I introduce concepts, so I might have somebody do, let's say, pushing a sled and like bounding and getting a big push and striking back at the ground. Like they might do that exercise. How much it translates to their sprint technique is going to be very different, across people. And so, yeah, with the track athlete, maybe it's like, well, we're definitely hoping long term to sort of have this acceleration model. And so we're going to maybe maybe try to plug this into the sprint more. Whereas the team sport athlete, it's like, they're not going to be executing a race in their sport. I mean, you can make the case for like combine testing that you can, teach people how to execute more. But even that, I think it can easily be fruitless because you need the physical development to go with it.
Yeah.
And you don't get to do the physical development with a basketball player that a track athlete's going to have. Like the track athlete they're going to sprint or run or, do plyos like 5 days a week during track season, and they're going to dedicate their life to developing this ability. And the basketball player is not going to do that. And so then like trying to plug this model into the basketball player is just, it's hard to really say that this is going to make much of any difference over time. So then my approach is more like, let's just try to develop the physical traits to the best that we can, and then just get the sprint exposure. Just let them practice, let them get reps. But yeah, I just don't put a lot of time into the details of sprint technique with team sport athletes. Again, every situation is different. So I do one-on-one training, so I have the ability to exist anywhere on the spectrum, right? So yeah, maybe there's cases of you have people that come out and just completely have choppy steps in a linear sprint. It's like, okay, we want to change something there. But even in that case, like, well, why do they have choppy steps?
Yes.
Maybe they're just really immobile. Maybe they don't really have any hip extension power to work with. And so like trying to get a longer stride, they can do it, but it's just going to take a long time and they're not actually going to run any faster. So yeah, I mean, there's not like a universal prescription, but yeah, I don't generally have a lot of, I'm not trying to fine tune things with team sport athletes. But it's more like, okay, well, yeah, let's get the sprint exposure. Let's jump and do plyos. Right. And so between sprinting and plyos, like we're trying to get that lightness on the feet and build that quality. Let's do some good strength training. Let's make sure we're strong, in hip and knee extension, and just try to, physically develop that capacity over time. And then let's see how that changes you in terms of your speed and in terms of your jumping ability. And then, yeah, like along the way, maybe there could be some efforts of, hey, I think you could alter this thing a little bit, like in your sprint, like maybe like try to get a big push during acceleration or whatever, like get a however you want to phrase that. I know you're not a big push guy, but like you can introduce that concept, but yeah, like I said before, the degree to which people are actually going to implement it, you just got to be open-minded on it. So yeah, whereas the track athlete, I think if you have the long-term mindset, you have the vision for the future of like, okay, you're probably, you're going to look something like this, we hope, over time. But yeah, even then you have to recognize that it's connected to their physical abilities. So yeah, I guess that was a pretty gray answer, but
No,
That's what I have to say.
it makes sense to me. It makes sense. Like for a track athlete, yes, there's bandwidths you need to eventually be in more so than this team sport athlete. And I guess, there's probably like, oh, how much does sprint technique matter for soccer players and intervention and robustness or whatever? But it does make sense to me that I would leave a more empty cup for a team sport athlete than a track athlete over a period of time. Especially to, I mean, we have game speed. We've had game speed podcast. How much the average play, especially. And being able to solve that problem. That seems like you're very much like more along the lines of like a Jay Schrader, Dan Fichter, create the qualities and then let them solve the problem. And
yes,
not so
exactly.
much. Yeah. Cool. Do you, you had something too about like stomp the ground, like, when people talk about, cause okay, this would be a thing. All right. That athlete is running this way because their vertical force ability is 60 out of 100. And so coaches will say, well, stomp the ground, as if that will take that ability from 60 to 70, as if there was 10 points missing in my theoretical scale because they had never thought of stomping the ground before. I'm like laughing as I say this. Anyways, so just thoughts on how to go about that process of an athlete developing that vertical force capability over time. Do you think it's something that just comes with the sprint exposure mostly? Is there other things like plyometrics or kind of everything? Thoughts on how that quality may improve? Like maybe there's the 1.2 stride usage may be shrinking over time. Just thoughts on that development side of things.
Yeah, so I think sprint exposure is like the biggest thing. And that's why I'm a fan of sprint volume, actually, which I know you just had Tony Holler on. So it's like a
good timing.
good timing to sort of talk about that topic. Yeah, it's, you got to think about how many foot contacts are you getting throughout your training, throughout your year, throughout your career, right? And, I think it's pretty clear, like there's a reason why track athletes have higher max velocity than other athletes, even other athletes who are like a similar size, right? So you can make the case of like, oh, well, the sprinter is just really light, whereas the football player is not. But even when you have, people who are the same, like similar size, like similar dimensions, you still have track athletes that at max velocity are much faster than, most basketball players or, some football players, outside of other sports. And it's because they run a lot, and even at the level of like 400-meter runners, 800-meter runners, mile runners, I'm sure, you have your track background. I'm sure, like a lot of those type of athletes that train a lot of endurance and don't do tons of speed work will destroy most other athletes in a 200. Like their max velocity is still way higher, and so I think there's a big value in just, okay, how many thousand times have you bounced off the ground? And every step you take in a sprint or in a sub-maximal run, right, is a plyometric foot contact. And so getting that exposure to a lot of running and sprinting over time, I think, is like the biggest piece of the puzzle. I do think that plyometrics are a great complement to that, specifically the plyos where you're like faster off the ground, because it's more specific to that quick vertical spike. So yeah, your pogos, your hops, your bounds, like that whole realm is probably an important piece of the puzzle as well. And then I do think strength training plays some role there. But it just comes down to that transfer question and keeping strength in its place, so to speak, where it's, first of all, we want to have an extensive sprinting background built up from childhood before we even introduce strength, so that your body is primarily adapted to speed, as opposed to squatting. So first, you want to have a big athletic background first, and obviously genetic talent helps there too. Mm-hmm. And then when you add strength, you add it in relatively small doses, where it's like a small piece of the program compared to the amount of sprinting and jumping you're still doing, and then you track the transfer over time by actually measuring things and then making decisions accordingly. So that's sort of like 1,000 foot view of it. And then all the decisions that can come along the way, as obviously like, there's a lot of diversity, but so that's where I get into that, that strength versus speed and like managing those things. And, for me, so I measure fly times all the time. Like pretty much if an athlete's healthy and I don't think they're going to get hurt, then we're measuring fly times like often because I want to know what is the impact of your training right now on your speed, and what is and also like just what is the condition of your body right now, and so that guides decisions for me a lot, where I can say, all right, you know what, I can think of like one example. I have a softball player who was doing softball, was doing like kind of random workouts at school and like, like a gym class type thing. And then training with me, unfortunately, like 3 times a month. um, but so, over this, like had this stretch of a couple months where she got a lot stronger. Her broad jump improved by 6 inches, which is like, okay, great. Strength, athleticism, boom, like let's celebrate conjugate method for the win, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, her resisted sprint on the 1080 sprint was got significantly faster. I think it was 3/10 faster in over 20 meters, which is like pretty good
Yeah.
chunk of time.
Yeah, that's real good.
Her regular 20-yard sprint was not any faster
Huh.
after all that. So she got faster basically everything starting at the slow end of the spectrum up to a certain point, and then her actual regular sprinting hadn't changed. And so, I look at something like that and I think, okay, we need more sprinting exposure, like unresisted sprinting exposure specifically, and like max velocity specifically, even though she's a softball player and not going to sprint past 20 yards in a straight line. Because max velocity does like bleed down into your acceleration, right? And so that's a case where she was naturally good knee bender, like could deep squat, like barbell back deep squat, no problem. Like looked great. And it's like, okay, but I can already see this trend of we're getting better at things that are relatively slow. Broad jump is not very fast. It is explosive. It is, it's a power movement and it's like a good thing to improve, but it's still a lot slower. It's a much bigger time frame that you're going to use to generate that impulse, than even the beginning of a sprint, like the acceleration portion of a sprint. So there's still a big disconnect between broad jump and speed, and or even just like the athleticism that you need for a sport that involves speed and quickness. So in her case, that would be an example of like, even though she was a young female athlete who wasn't like super strong or anything, not like she was a 1.5 body weight squatter or anything like that. I think she would have been better off not squatting for a while,
Mm-hmm.
or really even doing split squats, or like any type of deep knee bending strength exercise. I think she'd be better off without it, and specifically trying to develop the speed end of the spectrum. And yeah, so I know that's like, man, in the strength and conditioning world, that is heresy, right? To say like a young female athlete, should avoid this type of strength training, but I think it's legitimate. And I've even had like other examples of this where I've got a girl who's pretty talented right now, gymnastics background, and starting out with like pretty good general strength from 8 years of gymnastics, but is transitioned over to track and field. And for her, I initially started, she had not like done traditional strength training. She did, pistol squats on a balance beam and stuff like that. Um, I initially started like, okay, we're going to sprint, we're going to jump, we're going to train across the spectrum. And we're going to do some like, typical heavy strength training. And I think there was a negative impact, in the short term. And so it turned into, okay, well, we did that for a little bit. Let's actually back away from it now and see what impact that has. And we stopped lifting. She got faster within a couple weeks, and not even just like one workout, but like consistently faster. And so then I was like, okay, so we got to really keep an eye on this, as we utilize strength training. Like we got to be strategic with what type we do, how much we do, and then we got to keep measuring over time so we know what's going on. And so now I've like pretty dialed in with her now, and she's having a lot of success, and so it's again 13-year-old female, to say that there's some level of like not strength training that needs to happen, not a common opinion, but I'm sitting here taking the measurements and finding out. So I'm not just arguing theory here. I'm like, look, this is what happened. And I've done it a couple times where, okay, you know what, let's put some squats in a couple times, like, and just see. And then, fly times like get a little slower, and you take them out and they get a little faster again. And it's like, okay, so we're just trying to nudge your strength up over time. Yes. But I'm always going to try to get that balance and get that shift back to speed. And that's probably somewhat unique for her because of her background. Already super mobile and more strong than most 13-year-old girls, right? And so I'm not saying this is a general prescription for 13-year-old females, but in her case, she doesn't have a sprint background. She has a gymnastics background. And I think she needs to build up more sprint background and prioritize that before strength training is going to have more transfer. So yeah, I think that, the strength versus speed thing is just like a huge, huge topic. And yeah, I mean, I could just rant all day about that.
Yeah, that's
so, yeah.
I tell you, I have all these questions. We'll have to come back and hit the back end of this question list here. And a lot of it was about like strength transfer to speed and things like that. You had some really interesting posts on that I wanted to get into. But one of the things that popped up for me as you were talking about this is, yes, the need for more exposure and solving a problem. And what's interesting is to think, like, if we have a team sport athlete, let's say we want to give them some abilities, kind of like a track runner, to give them that ability to maybe get up in the open field, open up a little bit, or whatever.
Yep.
And we think that these like neat little skips are the way to do it. To me, I'm like, well, what if you just had those athletes, again, it is the T word, it's tempo, but I don't know, what if they just all ran 4 or 5 200s every now and then? That is, to me, actually the best natures, with hopefully not clodhopper shoes too, because that does impact your ability to supinate and feel the ground and feel that force coming back up. To me, it doesn't get a whole lot simpler than just that basic running on a flat, fast track for a repeated period of time. Not being stupid. We're not like going to go, hey, we're going to go 8 400s and then it will be clodhopper running, but running that's at least fast enough to have a bounce to it, and doing that with some level of exposure. And you were saying, yeah, I think you used some tempo or longer runs in your training. And to me, it seems like if I wanted to give someone who lacked that vertical spike some more of that specific strength, it could be as simple as, hey, let's just do a little bit more tempo running. And, again, I do think I like Tony's system. I feel like he gets a lot of that out of the X factor, the plyometrics, that bounce type thing. I just think it's like, well, how am I giving the athlete bounce? For me, tempo worked to give me bounce. I like that. So anyways, that was just my thought.
And you're not alone in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't, with the people that I work with in person, I don't get much of a chance to like program for them because they have so many other things going on.
Yeah.
But I have had some cases where I'll have a track athlete who's like a blank slate. And in that case, I'll tell them, hey, go do it, because, they're going to run alone. So I'm like, I don't want to make something hard for them, that like some brutal thing for them to have to do. But let's go run 10 100s at 15-second pace, and with like as much rest as you want. Like, it's not actually conditioning. We're just trying to get some bounces off the ground.
Yeah, bounces. That's so the key. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're using that to complement like a couple days of actual sprint training. And then also with some people that I work with remotely. Like that easy running is one of the categories that I hit consistently. So like the easy 100s, or even like, 30-second trail run, or, that type of thing. Like, fast jog, 30 seconds times 10 reps, like just kind of, walk for a minute between. It's not conditioning. It's just accumulating bounces off the ground to develop that lightness on your feet. And okay, so going back to that vertical spike and how we get it, this is, I think it comes from all this physical development that we just talked about. The big question I'd say right now with all the research coming from Ken Clark, which Ken and I are like, we've talked and we're, I would say friends at some level as much as you can be via social media. Like we're cool and we've talked about this before. He's got this research about thigh velocity and downward foot velocity and how, elite sprinters have higher velocities during the swing phase. And so there's kind of this belief that's being popularized that, that higher velocity creates that vertical ground spike. And I'm very skeptical of that. I think, obviously, yeah, we have like these series of things that are all connected that happen as people run faster. I don't think that we can intervene at the level of hammering the ground harder intentionally or like trying to create that higher velocity in the air. I don't think we can intervene there and create that vertical spike. Or at least I'm very skeptical of that being, like generally the way that it's going to happen. I think it's much more from what we've talked about. You bounce off the ground, you develop something in your legs that is different than if you are lacking all that elastic volume. And there's something that is something structural that changes, and it's not conscious. It's not about conscious effort. And I think, the running volume having a positive impact is like one of the signs of that, because we're not talking about high effort running. And we're also talking about athletes that don't do a lot of high effort running, right? Like even like we talked about some of the longer race competitors, they develop a quality in their legs over time that other athletes don't have. And I think that's really what facilitates all those other components of sprinting, like all those other kinematic things that we can look at, like the thigh velocity and the downward foot velocity. So yeah, I mean, I think you can easily have, I've seen it, like a cross country runner could have a higher RSI than a basketball player.
Yep, I've seen that too, 100%.
Yeah, like cross country runners have bounce in their legs, it's because, well, that's their sport.
Yes,
they bounce off the ground, and so yeah, they develop that capacity, and it has nothing to do with them trying to hammer the ground hard.
Yeah, they're not thinking They're not running their race thinking hammer the ground, hammer the ground.
Right, and like, yeah, it has nothing to do with front side mechanics or anything of that nature. They're just getting a lot of exposure to bouncing off the ground. And so yeah, I would say, like, looking at the sort of the research now that, particularly that Ken Clark has come out with, I have a little different interpretation of it than he does. And again, I've talked about with him, and we're like, we largely agree, but then he's sort of like, but yeah, I do think that, this thigh velocity plays a role. And I'm like, well, I can't say it doesn't play a role. I just don't think it's the place that we can change. Yeah. Like, we don't start by changing that. I think we start by changing the physical capacity, and then
starting with strength, working out the
thigh velocity comes from that as you develop physically. So yeah, that was, I wanted to get that out there because, like, when you talked about how do we get the vertical ground spike, I mean, there's sort of this growing belief now that we get the vertical ground spike by changing technique, and I don't think that's really true. That is, of course, my opinion, but
yeah, I guess I'll say not to make this a 3-hour show. I guess I'll just say my thoughts. Bouncing, literally, no pun intended. Bouncing off what you said is I do think that a straighter leg, like a track person's leg that's a little straighter coming down to the ground, has more potential energy than like a bent leg to create a vertical spike. That makes sense to me. And actually, I haven't read the Ken Clark research specifically with that, but it makes like the idea of angular velocity, and Darian Barr has been here talking about rotational velocity, and that all makes sense to me. I guess maybe I like stories. I think things that are really simple, like a story or visual, are helpful. So I like it was I think a Norwegian sprint coach had a really good paper that I was sent. It was thinking about sprinting as we talked about a wheel, like a hula hoop that you're spinning, like spin the hula hoop so it's spinning in the air and then it bounces. It's like a hula hoop bouncing and spinning along the ground. Like take a hula hoop and spin it and it bounces along the sidewalk. Well, it's like, well, how could I get that hula hoop to go faster? Well, I could spin it faster, but the spinning it faster, it's not just the front, it's the back, it's the whole wheel has to spin faster. And the whole wheel spinning faster is not just because if I just stomp my front leg down farther, what happens to the back leg? What happens to the rest of the body? There's more going on than just, and again, it's kind of like the same, to me, that's the same idea as my squat max is 300, 310s on the bar. You're my coach and you just say, just push harder, Joel. You know, it's like, I can't.
Right.
This is as much as I got, coach. So, but then you could also increase the tensile ability of that wheel. That wheel could have a higher, if it's like a really like, I don't know, like a kid put a kink in it. It's like, I mean, that would mess up the wheel, but it's like, you know, it's like real soft. Then if you put more tensile, like vibrate, you know, it was more like a steel tensile grade, maybe it could bounce hard, but you don't get that through telling somebody. You get it through repetition of the fascial elastic system, the structure, the way we angle ourselves. And to me, tempo or like repeated plyometrics or whatever you're going to do to increase that and improve that. And again, I do think I do think tempo does help an athlete to, in concert with the structure, also make the technical adaptations on their own. That would be my belief. I don't think that you could just tell someone to do the technique without that I just feel like nature makes it simple, you know, like just doing it. It just doesn't have to be that hard, you know, like just go out and that's just my thought. I don't know. Anything, do you have anything with that? Just because I think we'll round down kind of with that. I'll save the rest of the questions for another time.
I think the hula hoop is an example. Even just like if you think about bouncing a ball, like say you threw a ball forward and it was going to bounce, like, and you had a highly inflated, let's say basketball, or you had a flat basketball. Well, the flat basketball is going to slow down and move at a much slower pace and not going to go as far versus an inflated ball. It's like the same kind of concept. You physically change the object, and that influences how it's going to travel across the ground, you know? Same things like the hula hoop with the kink in it or whatever, or versus if it's more stiff. Yeah, that was the only thing that really came to mind. But yeah, I think we're pretty aligned on the concepts we're talking about. Yeah.
I mean, again, the sprint step, there's so much complexity in sprinting. Literally could talk about this all day. Like even what you're saying, like some of the qualities that lead someone to a different hip height, ground width than another. Like I'm honestly just even tacking them on in the recent months thinking like, okay, well, it's body shape, it's power in 1/10 of a second. It's like, you know, a rotational ability. Like there's so many, you're right. We are still learning about so many of these things versus just, just looking at just one thing. It is this complex interaction. So there is a lot to talk about, but it's just cool the answer doesn't have to be that complex. It could just be, you know, it could literally just be a few things just done savagely well, you know, in the process of natural development.
Yeah. The training solution might end up being pretty simple. But yeah, it's something I've said in some of my posts is like, what do I say? The complexity of the human body and the diversity between people, that like forces us to open our mind to like different solutions. It's just really, really difficult to be like, this is the technique that we have to use. If you think about like how different people really are and how complex the body is, like you were saying, all the different things happening in the body during sprinting. Like there's so many factors there that it's hard to, like one, you can't force people into a model, but two, you don't know things. You know, you can theorize them and you can kind of test them out, but like you just don't have this black and white answer of, you know, this is the right way to sprint and this is not. It's just endless exploration.
Yeah. And we all can kind of explore however far, you know, if you want to, you can go infinitely deep on some of these rabbit holes. But what we covered today, I love talking to you, Dan. I love how your mind works and how you put not just the ideas out there, but you have like the data points behind it, linking research behind it. And I love your practical approach to all this stuff. So, hey, I know we didn't cover everything today, But awesome talking to you for this conversation, Dan. And anything else before we get out of here? Either any closing thoughts? Obviously, most people know where they can find you, but different pages you run or any products you want to talk about. So before we get out of here, anything you want to share on that level?
Just one more thing. I want to say that I do address sprinting technique in my training, and I'm not trying to criticize that practice. I just do it in a way that, like I said, is experimental. And I'll even tell a kid, like, hey, look, we're going to try this and see what happens. I don't say this will make you faster. It's just a sort of an open-minded approach. And then, maybe like less time and effort put into it than other people, but it's not like I just ignore it. I'm not just, telling people to sprint and just not caring how they do it at all. So yeah, I just want to make sure I'm not like shifting too far to one side of that debate, Yeah, speed.science0 on Instagram is the speed science account. That would be the place for most of this content. I do have some other things on YouTube, which is just I'm just Jump Science, I think, on YouTube. Sometimes some like longer form content comes out on YouTube. And then, people have been asking for a speed science program for years. So I'm trying. My issue is I start thinking about making a speed program, and I just run into like all the different types of people and how the approach might need to be a little different, and then how to solve that issue. And I just, I'm just not very good at like, oh yeah, we'll just make an 8-week program and sell it. Like, it's, I tend to like want to have like some really thorough solution, which is very difficult to do. Yeah. So that's why it hasn't happened. So yeah, maybe there'll be a speed science program sometime soon. We'll see.
Yeah, to honor the complexity of the body in a program is not an easy task.
It's tough.
Yeah, it's a good thing you said that with the technique too. I was going to call this show Dan Bach Says Technique Doesn't Matter. That was going to be the title, so I'll just change that now. So
just throw me under the bus. It's fine. I can take it.
Oh man! All right. Well, hey, awesome having you on the show, Dan. Thanks again.
Yeah, it was very fun. Thanks.
That wraps up episode 337. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next week.